Okay. We've heard a lot about mapping and recording and documenting and how incredibly important all of this is to rebuilding and to managing cultural heritage. And the question of how sustainable these activities are has also been raised yesterday, whether it's how you keep hold of the data records and so on. I just wanted to start Michael's talk by introducing the slightly broader issue of sustainability around the question of who owns the museum. Because the museum is the key arbiter, certainly in the heritage industry, of who owns the interpretation and the dissemination and the availability and the civic space associated with the cultural heritage. Interestingly, where's my second slide? Where have I got? Okay. What? Oh, God. Back. Okay. Some of you will be old enough to remember this. Sorry, you can't hear me? Okay, sorry. There are two big museums in London. One is the British Museum, which is the kind of archetypal owner of cultural heritage as archaeology, as a kind of treasure, as a kind of guardian of artifacts from around the world. And the other is V&A, which in many respects looks like the British Museum as a kind of place, but starts from a very different perspective in the great exhibition of 1851. And the idea of Prince Albert that it was all about trade and developing the creative industries and through that, world peace. The V&A reappears in 1988 on the political map by Margaret Thatcher, who tasked the V&A and the first woman director, Esther Cole, with regrounding the museum as a place where people might go, rather than it being just a place of curators. And she gave the advertisers, or the advertising campaign, to Maurice Saatchi, who put up these six very controversial posters which had death threats lobbied in Estelle Cole's direction, which took away the power of the museum, or the V&A, from the curators, and said that actually it's about a social space and its primary place is as a cafe. So it was this very famous campaign about fantastic culture attached to an ace cafe. Now the idea when we went to Sudan was that Sudan is both the victim and the beneficiary of the foreign mission, the archaeological mission that goes and digs up these amazing treasures, really starting with the Aswan Dam and the building of the National Museum. It's a beneficiary because they have absolutely fabulous archaeological remains. It's a victim because none of the money or the infrastructure has gone into the Sudanese museum structure. So we are working with an organization that represents the government, museums the whole way across Sudan that have zero in terms of infrastructure or resources or any of the development that you associate with museums. So this is both an opportunity to rethink what can a community museum do. So we've introduced this notion of community as a way of representing how can a museum in Africa be sustainable? How can it be part of the cultural heritage industry and make benefit out of that, and at the same time not design its role in the future as being the janitors, the cleaners, the cafe runners of its cultural heritage? Because the wonderful thing about Sudan is that its cultural heritage is still alive, that when you travel through Sudan, people are still living their cultural heritage. So how can that become part of the museum? How can the museum be re-owned by its community? And that is the kind of open brief that we've taken back to 3 museums that represent the kind of Western trajectory rather than the Nile Valley where all the foreign missions are. And Michael's now going to explain this in more detail.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for inviting me today. Hopefully this is... So very briefly, this is Sudan. Everyone knows Sudan. Is this a pointer? No, maybe it is. Maybe it's not. Right, so Khartoum is here in the middle. This is the River Nile. And basically, the project we're working on covers the western part of Sudan. All of this western side is currently unreachable by even international people. It's in the red zone. It is currently a war zone. But El Obeid is on the border between Khartoum and the west. And our remit was to try and create heritage museums for the people who live in Western Sudan. And we started in Omdurman. Omdurman is the city where the Khalifa settled the people of Western Sudan in 1885 after defeating Gordon in Khartoum. And we lost him. You coming back? Sorry. Are you back now? Basically, well, we lost him completely now. Oh, there he is. Okay, before he goes again, quickly, the Khalifa needed to keep an army in Omdurman to protect him against what he expected to be an imminent attack. And so he insisted that the whole population of Western Sudan moved to Omdurman and settle around him. And he created a pilgrimage tradition of visiting the Mahdi's tomb 6 times a year for all the tribes of Western Sudan. And as a result, not only did he bring all the people from Western Sudan, but he brought all the trade from Western Sudan. So Omdurman is a very fascinating city. It is an instantaneous pop-up city created as a center for trade and spiritual values. And it was also a place where the communities of Western Sudan identify themselves as their sort of capital city, and they describe their arrival there as the Great Migration, and still people in Omdurman refer to the Great Migration. And this is a good opportunity for us because it is still the Great Migration. The wars and conflicts in Western Sudan has resulted in the population of Omdurman growing from 20,000 to just over 2 million in 10 years. And those 2 million people represent a significant proportion of Western Sudan's population. So as the first community museum, we have an opportunity there to create a location for them to express their culture. El Obeid is on the way to Western Sudan and is the place where Kordofan has its capital city, and is also a major refugee center. Over 70% of the population. Closer, Mike. Is that better? 70% of the population are refugees, and from both South Sudan, Nuba Mountains, and from Darfur. And then Nyala itself, which is the second biggest city in Sudan, constitutes probably about a third of the population of Darfur. So nearly 2 million people now. And yesterday, the IPDs were declared by the Sudanese government as no longer IPDs. They are now suburbs of Nyala. So Nyala has overnight become 3 times the size it was before yesterday. So to show very briefly what the heritage looks like in terms of the local communities who we're serving, this is the Ummah Party having a reunion in the Khalifa House, celebrating the culture and heritage of the Ansar, who are the direct descendants of the Khalifa and the Mahdi families. And they see the Khalifa House as being the sort of cultural and spiritual expression of the Ansar tradition. At the same time, it is also seen by the Wali, the local governor, as being the centre of the whole of Omdurman's 2 million population, which is about 100 and 200 maybe different cultural people. El Obeid celebrates its much more specific Kordofan culture, but as you can see from when we arrived at the museum, the Nuba people greeted us, and the Nuba mountain dancing is what actually you see and presented as Kordofani culture, even though they actually come from South Kordofan, and this is North Kordofan. Below you'll see a gathering of heritage and traditions that were brought for our celebrations, which Zaki attended last week, which celebrates the community bringing its heritage together. On the right you can see them actually gifting gifts to the museum. And finally Niala, which is in Darfur, which we visited last week, which has been closed for 12 years due to it opened for one day in 2006 and closed immediately because of the conflict situation. And Zaki went with Ikram last week and reopened the museum as a community centre. And it is a place, an opportunity for the heritage of over 100 communities living in that part of Darfur to have its cultural expression be available to the school children living in Darfur. The problem with Niala is that Niala is nearly 75% women and children, and the education groups there have very little identity anymore because they've been moved from their 100 different locations. And so this museum gives an opportunity to create a place where children can come and visit and actually see the heritage which they've lost. So this is a great opportunity to bring together this process. Now to do this, there's the challenge of Darfur itself, which is a mountainous territory the size of France with no roads, or maybe one road actually, I think, and 3 airports, and very little knowledge about the heritage from the local people. But one of the advantages of the Sudanese is they all love their heritage, and so one of the great ways of gathering heritage is to ask people, where is your heritage and where are you from? Oh, we just lost them again. We'll be back in a second. While we're waiting. So basically part of our project is to put together I don't know if it's going to come back or not. Oh, it is. Is to put together a map of heritage of the area so that local people can express it and discover it. We have the benefit of 2 studies, one done in 1953 by Glencairn Balfour Paul, who, as you probably know, is a very close friend of the Sheikh, or was until he died 10 years ago. And his heritage his mapping of the heritage of Darfur is one of the few academic studies made of Darfur. And he defined 4 different periods. But to be honest, nobody actually has any archaeological scientific studies of Darfur heritage beyond minimal studies done in the 1980s. And the 4 periods which we have proposed for the history of Darfur are actually just theoretical. No one has actually done or proven this theory beyond the kind of initial outlining. And so the Torah legendary population could go back, well, hundreds of thousands of years possibly, but certainly to 20,000 or more. The Darju, no one actually knows where they came from, but supposedly maybe Chad, but no, again, not well known. We lost them again. So just quickly moving on, we have, until recently, the only maps available were the 1960s, 70s redraw maps of the maps made in the 1940s and 50s. But very recently, the German aid agency has done a digital Landsat map for registration of all the property of Darfur. And we have been given the opportunity through Sudan Memory, who is a partner with ICROM and the British Council and ourselves, to use this database as a GIS base map for the heritage of Darfur. They're creating 9 regional centres where the GIS map will be placed, and they've given us the opportunity to place on that a layer of archaeology of heritage that we gather together. So basically, very quickly to show you, before we lose everything again, no, gone again, back soon. It's rather like Darfur, actually, this map. 1 minute you look there, it's all gone again. We have the odd 1990s maps that we were given as well, which has some heritage recorded more accurately, but that's it, basically, for Sudan. So just to give you an example of what local communities can do, when we were in Niala last week, we met a professor, Adam, who gave us a reference to a site that no one knew about called in Jabal Sabka, and he sent us photographs from his collection of the heritage. So basically this is an example of local communities identifying identifying sites which nobody knew about just by asking people what heritage they have in their area. And we have these other 2 scientific studies that were done in 1953 and then 1983. Very quickly looking at what the problem of identifying sites from local references. These are two sites which we know about from these publications, but also from local knowledge. These are the Sultan's tombs. These are the rulers of Darfur until the British commander of 1917 deposed the last Sultan. He's gone too. They have a site in Tura Mountains in the centre of what is now the rebel heartland, so nobody goes there at the moment apart from the odd rebel. And they have these huts which were rebuilt in 1890 by the last Sultan as thatched houses. And from the air, these ruins, now ruined, the roofs are blown off, look exactly like burnt-out villages. And there is a large mapping project in Darfur identifying ruined and burnt-out villages. But actually, the burnt-out villages could well be heritage sites similar to the ones which are identified through the local knowledge of the sites. So this shows you down here. Whoops, going back again. Down here, somewhere there. So these are actually not burnt-out villages, but they are the tombs of the sultans. But from the satellite photography, impossible to tell the difference. Very luckily, though, so this is a map showing all the identified burnt-out villages from the Darfur region, which could be heritage or they could be burnt-out villages. And of course, without the local knowledge, we won't be able to identify it. Part of our project is to work with our friends, the National Museum, who very luckily can travel in these areas without any problem because they are local people. And this is two sites, which is a place called Keb Kebir, which is where the headquarters of the rebels are based, in north of Darfur. And these two sites in Shoba, down here, somewhere, there we are, those two, are the last intact mosques and palaces of the Sultan Turaib. So from the air, from our satellite photographs, we can identify them as these sites, which we know from the Glencairn's publications. These are his drawings, Glencairn's drawings in 1953. And then, oops, in a minute, we'll be back again. But then very luckily, we have some photographs from 1919, which was when the last time they were surveyed. And then in 2017, the National Museum was able to go back and do the first records. And this kind of ground truthing means that we can actually transform sort of very ancient records and local knowledge into real heritage. But we don't, at the moment, NCAM is not trained in the satellites and the nice drones that we saw yesterday. But we're hoping to train them to use some of this technology and some of the iPhone technology and therefore improve the mapping techniques. But at the moment, this is what we can produce from those drawings, their measured surveys and photographs. But as you can see, a very unique, interesting monument, particularly interesting because it's identical to a church which was identified as El Ashir on the Nile Valley, suggesting that possibly there are pre-Islamic origins to some of the cultural heritage in Darfur, which nobody knows about yet. But again, this is all speculation because no one's been there and no one's excavated it. So it's like France without any studies done. And then this is a very interesting palace. It's a Shoba Palace, which is a 1760s, 70s building. But it's built on top of what is quite clearly a massive earlier structure. You can see these stone walls, again, which are identified both with Dajor and even Tungur structures, which go back hundreds of years before the palace of Sultan Turaib. So potentially, if this site was surveyed and then possibly excavated, we would have a very good stratigraphic evidence for the history of Darfur in that region. And this just shows the extent of the structures around the palace. So the palace is this little structure here, there. And these are the walls around it, which are related to this earlier palace structure. And this is the surveys done by the NCAM in 2016. And this is the NCAM surveyors doing their survey with a survey pole up here. But they drove there in a Land Rover about 18 hours from Al Fasher, and they spent a afternoon producing these maps and drawings for us. Obviously, the intention would be, after the ground truthing is established, to go back with archaeologists and do further studies. So that's the plan that we produced from that. Very luckily, we actually know what all these rooms do, because a chap called George Brown went and lived with Sultan Turaib in 1793 and describes the function of the court and what each room and what each space, the summer interior summer rooms and the exterior rooms where the Sultan would meet his people. So we actually have not only a map and a plan of the heritage, but also we have a knowledge of how the Sultan used the heritage in that period to interpret the ruins. So very interesting records going back a long time. Very quickly, what will we do with this heritage? The idea is to bring the heritage, not only the archaeological heritage, but also traditions of heritage of the local cultures of Darfur, and make a map that's locally available for children and educators in the museums. And that mapping process will be used to teach and educate local Darfur schools about their heritage that they no longer can be amongst, and also their cultural origins and their cultural identity, which has been so threatened by the last conflicts of the last 12 years. Thank you very much for giving us space to talk today, and I hope that maybe in the future we can show you some future results. This project is hopefully going to be sponsored by the British Council. We've made an application. If we don't, we will have to try and do it within the existing British Council project we have to create the community museums. So museums are definitely going to happen because they're happening, and Zaki was there opening it last week, so well done to him. And in the future, we would very much like to see building on these community museums to enlarge our knowledge of what is, after all, a completely unknown area of Africa. Thank you very much.